Chess YouTube, what is going on in this video? Magnus Carlsen, he disrespects Alireza Firouzja on move 1 with the move 1h4, and Alireza, he returns the favor with 1a6. This is Magnus versus Alireza from a recent Title Tuesday tournament on chess.com, and this one is going to be a good one. Yes, Magnus in the end simply eviscerates Alireza, but not without a bunch of fireworks in between. It's going to be a very bumpy, very entertaining ride right here. All right, we have 1h4, 1a6, so far so good. Now Magnus, e4, trying to fight for the center, kind of retreating on his weird 1h4 plan for this game. Now here, black actually goes b5 in the spirit of the Owens defense. That is the standard plan in the Owens opening. You go a6, b5, intending bishop b7, putting pressure on e4 if there is a pawn there, and so on. But as you all know, this idea of a6 and b5, it doesn't really fight for the center, and white is a free hand to go e4, d4, and so on, and Magnus does just that. We have d4, bishop b7, bishop d3, defending the pawn on the e4 square, and now black goes e6, kind of the standard idea in this opening. Black may want to go bishop b4, or c5, or knight f6, and so on. These are all kind of standard moves in this setup for black. Now, how does white want to continue? Well, Magnus, he continues, knight f3, black goes c5, very standard stuff. Again, c5, counterattacking on the weak pawn on d4. And now Magnus, he just defends with the move c3, staying very safe, very solid. So far, everything looks actually pretty standard, except for this move h4 right here. And overall, the Owens opening with a6, then b5 is so good for white that white can sort of waste a move like h4 like this, and it doesn't really matter that much. But to be honest, this move h4, it might actually be useful later in the game. You can imagine, for example, if white goes, I don't know, e5, then knight g5, and queen to h5, and so on, the pawn actually could serve a useful role on the king side, or white could even go h5, h6, leaving his king on e1 or on f1, leaving the rook on the h1 square, and just going for the attack. So white here has a lot of options. All right, Alireza, how does he continue? He goes knight to f6, putting more pressure on the pawn on the e4 square. White goes queen to e2. And by the way, side tangent, but is anyone else a long-time epic chess watcher who just realized that Alireza Firouzja being a fashion designer in his YouTube videos isn't a joke? Alireza is actually a fashion designer. It took me until just now to realize that Epic Chess wasn't just making that up out of thin air. I mean, whenever I watch an Alireza game like this, I just think of Epic Chess and the Alireza fashion designer joke. But anyways, side tangent, back to the game. All right, here, black takes on d4, white takes back, and then here, black has a few options. For example, knight c6 is not bad, bishop e7 is pretty good, bishop b4 is pretty good. Overall, black has to find some way to develop. After all, white has those pawns on e4 and d4. He definitely has the space advantage, the center advantage, decent attacking ideas on the king side with h5, h6, and so on. So here, Alireza, he really does have to find some precise moves to get basically some sort of footing in the center of the board. Now here, black goes knight c6, pressuring d4, not a bad move at all. White goes knight to c3. And here, Alireza, he kind of goes off the deep end. I mean, you might expect a move like bishop to e7, or say b4, or d5, or d6. I mean, all of these moves, or rook c8, or queen c7, all of these moves kind of make sense. They kind of meet the demands of the position. Black here has to find a way to develop, potentially castle, fight for the center, and so on. These are all classical chess principles right here. But instead, Alireza, knight to g4. Okay, what is the idea behind this? I'm going to be honest, Alireza, the fashion designer maestro here, I don't know what he's doing. I mean, is the idea targeting this pawn? That doesn't make sense. Is the idea queen to f6? I mean, that runs into e5. That can't be good for black. And then, besides, g6 and h6 are being covered by the bishops. What else is black trying to do here? I mean, h4 is covered. You can't take the pawn with the queen. It's not really obvious. All right, white. Bishop f4. Magnus playing all of the best moves here for white. And now Alireza, he shows that he's really just having fun with this game. Knight to b4. Okay. Not the worst move in the world. There is an idea. You are pressuring the bishop. You are putting some pressure on it. You do sort of force bishop b1, at least if white wants to keep the bishop alive, which white does in the game, bishop b1. But overall, Alireza, with these knights on g4 and b4, this is not a coincidence. Alireza here is trying to have some fun, trying to throw Magnus off his game. And here, he goes for the move h5, just cementing his knight on g4 permanently, but in doing so, permanently weakens the g5 square as well. All right, Magnus here. He castles. No problem. Castles is the move. Of course, there were other ideas like d5 immediately is quite strong, as the queen on the e2 square does oppose the black king on e8, and that could be quite dangerous if black ever takes on d5 and white takes back. The king would be under check and so on. So d5 does make a lot of sense, but instead, short castles, Magnus here, getting his king to safety, getting it safe and sound, and playing just a fine game of chess. And now here, Alireza, he sort of, quote-unquote, punishes white for not going d5 earlier, and he goes d5 himself. So d5 on the board, white goes e5, and now we have that classical advanced French pawn structure with the pawns on d4, e5, e6, and d5. So what does this mean? Well, basically, whenever you have this pawn structure, oh, by the way, if you're a beginner, the pawn structure is essentially the fastest, easiest way to figure out what the plan is for both sides in almost any position. So if you're not sure in the middle game what you should be doing or what the grandmasters are thinking about, the first place to look, the first clue, is the pawn structure almost always. So here, the pawns are facing for white. They're pointing in this direction, and the pawn on e5 gives white the space advantage on the king side. On the other hand, for black, the pawns point in this direction, and the pawn on d5 gives black sort of a relative space advantage on the queen side. So white here should be attacking on the king side, going for the black king on e8. Meanwhile, black should be counterattacking on the queen side on the open c file and pressuring d4 and so on. All right, here, Alireza. Bishop e7 is the move. We have g3, queen to b6, pressuring d4. Very standard ideas for black in this French defense pawn structure. Then we have king g2, the fianchetto of the king on the g2 square. Very interesting. Knight c6, pressures d4 again. As you can see, black here piling up pressure on d4. That is the main idea for black in this pawn structure, along with perhaps f6 a little bit later. Now here, white, queen d2, again supporting the pawn on d4. So far, so good for both sides. We have rook c8, developing the rook to the open c file. So Alireza playing just some very logical chess so far. Nothing super fancy, just trying to pile up on d4, control the c file, and so on. Now here, white goes knight to e2. Now, this move here, the idea is he over-defends d4. Now white has 1, 2, 3 pieces defending d4. Therefore, if white needs to, he can move the queen or the other knight away from the defense of d4 without dropping the pawn. So by over-defending with the knight, white gains flexibility, and it can move any of these pieces here to a different square and still have d4 more than defended. All right, black here, queen to a5 is the move. What's the idea? Well, Alireza, he's trying to trade queens. If he gets that, if the queens come off the board, then, of course, the black king on e8 will not be under an attack, as without those queens on the board, it's going to be almost impossible to outright checkmate the opponent, at least in the next 5, 10, 15 moves and so on. Therefore, if the queens come off, the kings will be safe, and that means the biggest factor in the position will be the weak pawn on d4, and that would obviously be to Alireza Firouzja's benefit. So, black here, offering the queen trade, and Magnus, he has to decline, and he does that in the game with the move queen d1. Avoiding the queen trade, so far so good. Now Alireza, g6. The idea being supporting the pawn on h5, clamping down on f5, and so on. Now white goes a3, setting up b4 ideas, gaining space on the queen side. That could be strong for white. It's a very typical idea in these advanced French pawn structures for white. Now, black goes queen b6, getting out of the way of that sort of idea from white well in advance. Now we have bishop to d3, developing, king to f8, queen to d2, and then king to g7. So both sides fianchettoing their kings on g7 and g2. This certainly appears to be a good and safe square for both of the kings. Now, obviously, in theory, white could maybe in the future launch some sort of attack on the king side, but for right now, the black king on g7 is actually pretty safe. There's no obvious way for white to push the pawns, and if you can't push the pawns and go for a pawn break, the only other way to attack effectively would be some sort of piece sacrifice. But for right now, you know, what piece sacrifices are there? You can technically take on g6, but that would be kind of a bad move right now. So overall, black, for right now, is doing just fine. Now here, Magnus, he offers the trade of the dark squared bishops. bishop g5. This move is actually quite strong. The idea being, white here has all of his center pawns on dark squares. Therefore, this bishop is sort of a quote-unquote bad bishop. It's on the same color complex as his pawns. Therefore, the bishop, it really can't move that much. Actually, it's on the same color as literally all of the white pawns right now. Therefore, if you can trade off these bishops and maintain the light squared bishop, that would be excellent for white. And that is what happens. We have bishop takes, then queen takes, Magnus trading off his bad dark squared bishop, and all of his remaining pieces are quite good. A very good strategic objective accomplished right there. All right, black, queen d8. Alireza retreats the queen, and again, offers the queen trade, and again, Magnus should decline, and he does. Queen to f4 was chosen in the game. Alireza, queen d7, and then we have knight g5. A simple move, but it does increase the pressure on the king side. Now, potentially, the threat later in the game could be queen takes f7. Now, obviously, black, for now, has that guarded. However, on every single move, Alireza is going to have to check this little threat and make sure it's not that big of a deal. And in the long run, there could be some sort of forced heir, which allows some sort of sacrifice or capture on f7 to happen. So overall, it's just a good way to increase the pressure and potentially force out yet another mistake from the opponent. Now, here on move 25, Alireza, I mean, outside of the bizarre opening, outside of the first 5 to 10 moves, including knight g4 and knight b4, outside of all of that craziness, I mean, Alireza, he's played sort of a good game so far. I mean, you know, nothing to really complain about. But here on move 25, he makes a big mistake. He plays this move knight to a5. Now, this move is very thematic for this pawn structure, the knight, likely heading for either b3 or c4, both of those being very important and very weak light squares in the white camp. So it makes a lot of sense. However, it turns out the attack on the king side is happening so quickly for white that black doesn't really have time for something like this. Instead, the right move here for black was simply f6, intending f6, e takes, queen takes, with yet another trade of the queens. That was likely the best way to try and hang on. Now, instead, in the game, knight to a5 was chosen by Alireza, and this is where he starts to have some serious problems. White, he simply goes f3, driving back that knight. The knight goes back to h6. That is the only square. And then white goes g4, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Magnus Carlsen, I mean, it looked like the attack on the king side had stalled, but suddenly, he's breathed new life into the attack. We have the tension of the pawns on g4 and h5, and suddenly, Alireza, it looks like he's in quite a bit of trouble in this position. All right, he jumps in with his knight, knight c4, a decent move. But here, b3 drives back the knight yet again. We have knight to a5, then rook a b1, defending the pawn on b3. And now, the knight, it's simply doing nothing on a5. It can't go to c4. It can't take on b3. What is this knight doing? Not much. Here, Alireza, knight to g8 is the move. The idea being he's trying to find a better square for the knight. Maybe black wants to go, for example, queen to f8, knight to e7, then knight f5 or something like that. But overall, it's not really obvious where the knight is going. And at least on h6, it did a good job of defending f7. Here on g8, it's not really doing all that much. All right, here, Magnus, king g3 is the move. The king march has begun. Then we have rook to f8, black defending f7 in advance. Then queen d2, the queen flies back. Knight c6, the knight finds a better square. And then Magnus, knight f4, the knight jumps in. So far, so good. Both sides making very logical moves. So, black, bishop c8, we have rook bc1, piling up pressure on the c-file. And here, everything kind of led to this position right now in this game. And white has some pressure, but it's also not super obvious how to break through. After all, black here, despite having the really awkward king, the really awkward rooks, the really awkward knight, I mean, all the black's pieces on the king side are effectively tripping over each other. They can't develop, they can't move, but despite that, black is actually still doing relatively okay. So what happens here? Well, Alireza, he spots the free pawn on d4. This entire game, he's been piling up pressure on that pawn on d4, and he finally decides now is the time to capture on d4, to cash in our chips, and to win some material. However, this move, knight takes d4. It has a serious tactical problem. Here, Magnus, queen to c3 is the move. The queen slides up, pressures the knight. And of course, the knight cannot go back to c6, as then it would be dropped. So, with that in mind here, black goes queen to a7, trying to defend the knight. And here, Magnus, he just goes full beast mode. This guy just burns the chessboard down with this incredible bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes g6. Magnus, he knows all of his pieces are on virtually the best possible squares. For example, the bishop, the queen, this rook, the two knights, the pawns on f3, g4, and h4. I mean, everything in the position is basically optimized. And Magnus knows it is now or never. You have to sacrifice the piece, and he goes for it. Bishop takes g6. Okay, first of all, what is the idea behind this move? It's simple. It is a deflection pawn sacrifice. Here, obviously, black cannot take with the king as the knight controls g6. However, the pawn on f7 can technically take on g6. But if black does that, then queen to c7, hitting the king, is incredibly strong. For example, if f takes, queen c7 comes in, attacking the undefended queen on a7. Then we have queen takes, rook takes, king to h6, and then knight to f7, and black ultimately has to give up the rook to avoid being checkmated. And that is the strength of the idea by white. Bishop takes g6. Now, here, what should black be doing? It turns out black's best response is knight to e7, attacking the bishop with the knight and trying to force it back. Now, instead, Alireza in the game, he must have miscalculated or misevaluated something because he plays the move h takes g4. But this move right here ultimately leads to him being absolutely eviscerated in this game. And no, I am not exaggerating. From here, Magnus, he just puts on a masterclass in how to finish off what do we call it? A halfway cooked opponent. How to finish off a halfway cooked Alireza Firouzja. All right, here. He takes on g4. F takes g4. And here, black goes from bad to worse with this logical-looking move, knight to h6. This makes a lot of sense to me, to my amateur mind. Black here defending f7 with the knight. It looks logical. But here, white crashes in with the knight. Knight to h5, hits the king on g7. Now here, the king has to go back to the g8 square. Instead, if you take on g6, of course, then rook to f6 would be checkmate on the spot. Obviously, you don't want to allow that as black. So instead, in this position, king to g8 was chosen. That is the only move effectively. But here, Magnus, knight f6. The knight jumps in, hits the king on g8. Where is the king going to go? It goes to g7, but then knight h5, king g8, and finally, Magnus freaking Carlsen. He plays the move that just, this is the final nail in the coffin for the fashion maestro Alireza Firouzja in this game. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea right here. The key idea is queen takes c8. He gives up the queen. However, if you take the queen, it's checkmate in one move, as rook takes c8 actually leads to checkmate, as black has no way to block the back rank, plus the knights control g7 and h7. That would be an absolutely beautiful finish to this game. Of course, Alireza, the fashion maestro, he's just too good for that. Instead, knight to e2, he fights on, forks the king and the rook on the c1 square. Will this be enough to fight back in the game? Well, Magnus, he goes back, king g2. Then we have knight takes c1, and then queen takes c1. So the dust has settled. Magnus here, what did he win? Well, he has the three minor pieces versus the one minor piece and the extra rook. So Magnus here effectively has two minor pieces versus the rook. That is a big advantage for white. However, it's not completely game-ending, but the game-ending part of the whole scenario here is the fact that the black king on g8 is just completely out of the game, and the black rook on the h8 square is also locked out effectively forever. So, black here, queen d4 is the move, pressuring e5, but here, Magnus, knight f6, hits the king, king g7, and from here, we have bishop takes, knight takes, and then the finishing blow, knight takes e6, hitting the king, and of course, the queen on d4. Look at this beautiful fork, and right here, Alireza, he runs out of time. That is what the timer means right there. But of course, Alireza, I mean, being down the queen against the goat, that is just not a good scenario by any means. So, yeah, white here just completely eviscerated black in this game. Magnus eviscerating Alireza Firouzja. Yes, it wasn't the most serious game. Yes, Magnus opens 1h4 in this Title Tuesday game. And yes, black goes a6. But still, after that, they kind of did go back to standard play. And in the end, Magnus just completely crushed Alireza in spectacular fashion. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, comment down below. Is Magnus, your favorite chess player, or is it the fashion maestro Alireza Firouzja? Again, I feel like such an idiot. I'm watching Epic Chess, on and off once in a while. His jokes are a bit much for me sometimes, but I do watch his videos occasionally, and when I do, there's always an Alireza fashion maestro joke in there. And again, I can't believe I spent I've been in this chess YouTube space for maybe a little over a year now. And, I watch competitors sometimes, and I like Epic Chess, and they're funny videos. But this whole time, I thought he was just making up this whole Alireza fashion maestro joke. And it turns out Alireza is actually like a professional fashion designer or something. It blows my mind how I could not be aware of that. And I'm in this space. So, yeah, anyway, shame on me. But comment down below. Comment fashion maestro to support Alireza Firouzja and his new career as a fashion designer, which is not a joke. It's not a joke, Chess YouTube, despite my brain exploding right now. So comment fashion maestro down below to support Alireza in whatever career path he so chooses to pursue. And yeah, that's all for today. Smash that like button. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.